Hi, I'm Margie Holmes, psychologist, author, and educator. For today's episode, we'll talk about psychosocial support, psychological first aid, and stress debriefing. These are timely topics, especially after the horrific devastation in the Visayas caused by the earthquake and also by Typhoon Yolanda. Surviving a catastrophe of that magnitude is traumatic, and many believe that talking about the situation helps. But does it really? Ella Quintanar says, I think the survivors just need someone to talk to, someone to hug even. It's important for them to know that they are not forgotten. There was one survivor in Villamor who said that on the first day after the storm, their dead looked just like they were sleeping. On the second day, they began to bloat. And the stench, the smell of death is something that they will never forget. There are images that they will keep with them for the rest of their lives, such as the one I was just saying. They also spoke about how scared they were at night. The strangers would steal whatever little they had left. So they trekked to the airport in Tacloban when they heard that there were mercy flights leaving for Manila. And even if they didn't know anyone in Manila, they decided to go because that would be better than sleeping fitfully at night, not knowing whether they would wake up with their throat slit. That's a very good point, Ella, and I know that you speak from experience as you were there practically 24/7 since Yolanda hit us. Orly Tugob adds, I heard stress debriefing in some countries are no longer encouraged because those who have undergone debriefing had a hard time recovering since the process makes someone recall the horrors of the tragedy instead of simply forgetting. Orly cites one article which warns against one-time psychological debriefing. The article goes on to say that the first priority in disaster situations is to provide physical and psychological safety. Orly Tugob is also right. Thus, the need to distinguish between listening to people who not only want but need to share their experiences, and on the other hand, asking people to recall events even if they would prefer not to. In fact, Orly, the Psychosocial of the Philippines agrees with you. Its president has asked that critical incident stress debriefing, or what we call CISD, not be used for survivors of Yolanda because there is evidence that it impedes natural recovery. Now, Trelly Marigsa asks, who reminds personnel about the ethics of psychosocial intervention? Based on survivor stories, there have been instances where survivors and or evacuees were treated as just cases and not as humans. And again, Trelly has a point. Ethics are absolutely important because we have to be sure that we attain the goal we want, which is helping Yolanda survivors and not adding to their misery. And one way to do that is to ensure that we have the competencies that we claim to have. Perhaps this might be a good time to differentiate between psychological PFA, which we call psychological first aid, stress debriefing or CISD, and post-traumatic stress disorder, which we call PTSD. So, psychological first aid is an informed approach for assisting everyone, from infants who also suffer from the effects, even though they can't verbalize it, to the elderly in the aftermath of disaster and or terrorism. So basically, what psychological first aid does is focus on three major things, which is contacting and engaging with those affected, so that people who seem like, they can't concentrate or anything, they seem like everything is unreal, will have someone who can offer psychological first aid to help them, focus themselves on reality, but not in such a frightening way because of number two, which is gathering information on their current needs and concerns. And finally, number three is providing safety, comfort, practical assistance, and linkages with collaborative services. So the people giving psychological first aid will have the appropriate information so that you can point them to the right direction depending on what they need. Now, it seems that most of all, this is what Yolanda survivors need at this very moment. And happily, training volunteers to provide this first aid can be done relatively quickly. Later, should some of the survivors need more help, therapy from psychiatrists and psychologists would be necessary, especially if post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD is involved. As Trelly shares, trauma healing is a multi-field practice. Healing comes in various times depending on the individual or the community. It is not necessarily immediate. Edna Aquino asks, is it possible that someone goes through a traumatic experience but may not feel the need for intervention and can just go on with their life? Absolutely, Edna, though many might need some psychological first aid at the start, if only to point them in the right directions regarding the agencies who they should approach for the financial, logistical, and government help they need. I would just like to add that these people who do not need more therapy or more help might be very helpful to listen to other survivors. But one thing these people have to know is not ask the survivors to compare themselves with this person who doesn't need a lot of help. You know, parang anyabang, look at me, if I can get over it, you can too, which is supposed to seem like encouragement, but actually may make the survivors feel a lot worse because what you're saying, kung kaya niya, but ako hindi ko kaya. Anyway, well, there's PFA, which is psychological first aid, CISD, even PTSD, which admittedly we haven't really discussed in full today. Now, is there anything coherent that we can hold on to right now for this show? Perhaps, and again, I am so sorry for another acronym, MPHSS can help. MPHSS stands for Mental Health and Psychological Support for Disasters. Now, why do I say this? Because MPHS looks at therapy or support in its entirety, meaning they recognize that support should not stop at emergency responses, even if they know that Band-Aid help or standalone psychosocial intervention is important. But it is also important for more integrated and long-term solutions. To quote Stephanie Raquel, psychosocial aid is something a lot of people neglect. The survivors, though smiling, are still traumatized. Aside from providing relief goods, building houses, and restoring their livelihood, ensuring the stability of everyone's mental health must be considered a vital aspect of the total rehabilitation plan. In other words, not just financial or physical help, but also psychosocial. And correct ka dyan, Stephanie. Well, that's it for today. Jump in the discussion by commenting below. I'm sure many of you have had experience with volunteering. We'd like to know about your experiences and your opinions. Please send me your comments, questions, and suggestions for future episodes on Facebook. Tweet using the hashtag AskMargie or send an email to askmargie@rappler.com. See you next week.